salespeople are not successfully differentiating our product from the competitors.
Brian clarifies Nick's earlier point to make sure he understood correctly and, perhaps, to state the situation to his advantage. He uses, "You're saying," to paraphrase Nick. To paraphrase means to restate something using different words. This is a useful skill in clarifying. We often paraphrase what we understood to check that it's correct. Then, notice how Nick paraphrases himself, partially to further clarify the point and, perhaps, to further restate the situation in a way that's advantageous to him.
Yes, that's right. They're not communicating to the customer the experience of using ColorMax. Not just facts and figures, but what makes ColorMax different in terms the customer can relate to.
It's interesting to note that in clarifying, we're not always just checking understanding, but also strategically restating the situation to our advantage. Later on in the dialogue, there's another example of clarifying.
But how do we measure success?
You mean, how can we tell if it's working?
Yes, that's right.
Cindy asks Nick, "How do we measure success?" Then, Nick, to make sure he understands, says, "You mean, how can we tell it's working?" "You're saying" and "you mean" are both ways to introduce a paraphrase for the purpose of clarification. Let's listen to some other ways to clarify.
Let me check I understand. Are you asking why our market share has increased?
Well, it all depends on what you mean by in the near future. Are you talking about next week? Or are we talking about the next 2 to 4 months?
Could you be a little more specific?
Let's go back again to the earlier part of the dialogue to examine how to deal with another kind of Q&A situation. What to do when you receive a hostile or aggressive question. Nick has just restated his belief that the poor sales are due to unclear communication to customers of value proposition. How does Brian respond?
Then why would you say that our market surveys are ranking us 30% ahead of the competition in the key values that we are promoting?
That's a fair question, Brian. I know your team has worked very hard on the launch, and I've studied the latest survey results.
Brian is on the attack here. He cites a market survey that seems to contradict Nick's belief that the value proposition is not being communicated to customers. Nick responds by saying, "That's a good question, Brian. I know your team has worked very hard." This is a kind of buffer, sometimes also called a softener or cushion. He uses this language to soften the disagreement that he expresses next. Using a buffer is one effective strategy for dealing with hostile questions. As a buffer, Nick could also say,
Thank you for your question.
That's a very interesting question.
I'm glad you asked that.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment on that.
Thank you for raising this point. You know, I really appreciate all your hard work.
Very good question.
Now that he's softened it with a buffer, how does Nick express his disagreement with Brian? He uses an idiom to describe his attitude to the marketing survey.
But the proof is in the pudding. We have to ask ourselves, why aren't we selling more steel?
The proof is in the pudding is a shortened version of the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Nowadays, people usually just say the proof is in the pudding. It means that the true quality or value of something can only be judged when it's tried and tested. The meaning can be summed up as results are what counts. So, Nick is saying that good market survey results are useless unless they translate into something real, profits. Understandably, Brian, as the marketing director, is not so happy about Nick's attacking the value of his market survey.
Nonsense. I think you have to take into consideration the fact that we have a lag time.
Nick, Brian, hold your horses. I can see we're butting heads a little bit, and it's not productive. Let's use the time we have left to sound out Nick's proposal. Max, who is the boss, gives us another good example of dealing with a hostile situation. He uses a couple of idiomatic expressions to calm everyone down. The informality of these idioms probably helps relax the situation. Hold your horses is used to ask someone to slow down. It usually implies that someone is moving too fast or assuming too much. Butting heads literally refers to two or more people or animals hitting each other with their heads, like deer. Max employs the softener a little to make the situation seem less serious. And he uses the inclusive we to remind everyone that we're a team. I can see that we're butting heads here a little. The image is humorous, which probably also works to smooth the situation. Now, Cindy has a question, but it seems as though she might not have been paying attention. What does she ask?
Can I come in here?
Go ahead, Cindy.
If we retrain all the salespeople,
Sorry, hold on a sec, Cindy. Perhaps that wasn't totally clear.
oh,
In the first phase, I'm just proposing we retrain the project engineers and key account managers, not the whole sales force.
Nick says, sorry, hold on a sec, Cindy. Perhaps that wasn't totally clear, to clear up a misunderstanding. A sec is an informal abbreviation for a second. It signals a relaxed tone. Also, earlier when Brian says Nick doesn't believe the market survey, do you remember how Nick replies?
So you just don't lend any credence to the survey.
That's not what I'm saying.
That's not what I'm saying is another way to clear up a misunderstanding. Here's some other language you could use.
Actually, let's go back to that point for a second. From what you're saying, I'm not sure that I made myself totally clear.
Oops, hold on a moment. I think there might be a slight misunderstanding about the scope of this project.
sorry, but that's not quite right. Instead of 70, 7, 0, I meant 17, 1, 7.
Since clearing up misunderstandings is such an important part in dealing with questions, let's practice that. First, you'll hear a cue or hint telling you where the misunderstanding is. For example, 40, not 30. Then you'll hear someone making a comment. For example, so what you're saying is our revenue has gone up 30%. Next, after the beep, correct the misunderstanding using the language we have just learned. In this example, you could say, oops, hold on a bit. I think there might be a little misunderstanding. Instead of 30%, it should be 40%. Note that it's often a good idea to put the correct information last, because that's what will stay in the listener's mind. All right, let's give it a try.
15, not 50.
When you're talking about adding sales staff, don't you think 50 is an awful lot? New orders, not market share.
Frankly, I just don't see how we're going to be able to increase market share by 5% over 6 months.
Retrain existing staff, not hire new staff.
From what you're proposing, I see a major problem being finding enough heads. How are you going to get 300 new staff?
And how did you do? Let's listen to some example answers. But remember, there are many possible correct ways to answer each question.
When you're talking about adding sales staff, don't you think 50 is an awful lot?
Oops, hold on a little bit. I think there might be a slight misunderstanding about the number I'm proposing. Instead of 50, I said 15, 1-5. Frankly, I just don't see how we're going to be able to increase market share by 5% over 6 months.
Sorry, I'm not sure I made myself totally clear. I meant increase new orders by 5%, not market share. From what you're proposing, I see a major problem being finding enough heads. How are you going to get 300 new staff?
Actually, let's go back to that point for a second. From what you're saying, I'm not sure that I made myself totally clear. Instead of hiring new staff, I'm proposing retraining existing staff.
After you've listened to the example exercises, it's always a good idea to go back and practice again for fluency. Try substituting new language for each example. Before we finish today's show, let's go back to the dialogue to examine one last point. Listen to Cindy and Nick continue their discussion. Nick has just said that he only wants to retrain project engineers and key account managers, not the whole sales force.
All right, but it's still a lot of people.
Right. I can see what you're getting at. However, I expect that with proper implementation, we can get the job done in a month.
Right, I can see what you're getting at, is a way to concede a point. That is, to admit that someone may be right. It's a kind of agreement and can also be used as a buffer or softener before you disagree. There are many more ways to concede a point. Let's look at a few.
Right. I can see what you're saying.
You may have a point there.
Yes, there's something to that.
Uh-huh. That makes sense.
All right, that's all for today's episode. Today, we've looked at a lot of effective skills and language for dealing with and asking questions. We've looked at opening a Q&A session, clarifying, referring back, dealing with hostility, and conceding a point. You've also studied some great business idioms. Thanks for listening. And hold your horses. We'll be back soon with the second in this two-part series on dealing with questions. See you then. You're listening to Business English Pod, the Business English podcast for professionals on the move. Welcome back to Business English Pod. Today's episode is the second in our two-part series on question and answer, or Q&A. The listening starts where we left off last time. Nick, the new European sales director at Harper Tolan Steel, is answering questions after his presentation. As you listen, pay attention to how Nick and Nick's boss Max deal with questions and manage the Q&A session.
But how do we measure success?
You mean, how can we tell if it's working?
Yes, that's right.
That's a good question. I would expect to see a 5% increase in order volume 3 months after the rollout, 10% within 6 months. That's the main criterion. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks. But I guess another general point I'd like to raise is about staffing.
Uh-huh.
With so much new blood coming into the company, a lot of sales staff feel that the writing's on the wall, and I think it's creating a bad atmosphere.
Let me check I understand. Are you asking about potential redundancies and how they might affect morale?
In a word, yes.
Well, everyone's job is on the line here. The most important thing is that we are fully committed to getting sales back on track?
I think that raises a different issue. We can address staff changes and morale in another meeting. Time's running short. Let's stay focused.
Okay. Well, I think we only have a few minutes left. Is there one last question?
Yes, if I can just come in for a second.
Yes, John.
Well, from what we're seeing on the UK side, the salespeople just don't feel our promotional materials are getting through to our most important customers. I'm talking about the decision makers, project managers, architects, etc. How do you think we can adjust?
That's a very interesting issue, but I'm not fully up to speed on the marketing situation in the UK. Brian, would you like to comment on that?
We can go into more detail about that in this afternoon's marketing meeting. But I would just like to point out that what you're saying just flat out contradicts the results from our market survey.
So, right. I'm afraid that's just about all we have time for.
Yes, thank you, Nick. We really are running on a tight schedule today, as I think everyone can appreciate. Now, Nick's proposal is definitely a go and needs our full support. Brian, I want your team to work with Nick's on the value proposition for the new training material and get back to me next Tuesday with a time frame for rollout. I'd like to have country managers retrain during next month's sales meeting, and we need to work fast. Okay, folks? Brian isn't going to be very happy about this, is he? Max is the boss, and he's made a decision. Nick's proposal is a go. That means he's going to adopt the proposal. You can also say, let's go with the proposal. Well now, let's go back through the dialogue to examine how Nick and Max deal with questions from Cindy, Brian, and John. We'll start with the exchange between Cindy, Nick, and Brian at the beginning of today's listening.
But how do we measure success?
You mean, how can we tell if it's working?
Yes, that's right.
That's a good question. I would expect to see a 5% increase in order volume 3 months after the rollout, 10% within 6 months. That's the main criterion. Does that answer your question?
First, Nick uses "you mean" to clarify Cindy's question about how to measure success. We covered this kind of clarifying in the first episode in this series, BEP 36. In response to Cindy's question, Nick says he expects a 5% increase in sales volume within 3 months after rollout or implementation of the new training. Then, Nick checks to make sure his answer is sufficient. Does that answer your question? This is a good way to make sure your audience is following you and to encourage discussion. There are other ways to check whether your answer is sufficient. Here are some of them.
Is that okay?
Does that make sense?
Do you see what I mean?
Do you know what I mean?
Are you with me?
Does that cover what you want to know?
Have I answered your question?
In today's listening, what comes next is another good example of clarifying. Cindy's talking about staff changes. Let's listen.
With so much new blood coming into the company, a lot of sales staff feel that the writing's on the wall, and I think it's creating a bad atmosphere.
Let me check I understand. Are you asking about potential redundancies and how they might affect morale?
In a word, yes.
As we learned in BEP 36, let me check I understand. Are you asking is another way to clarify someone's question. The reason Cindy's statement is vague and needs clarification is because she uses 2 idioms here, probably to give her tough question a casual tone in order to maintain a relaxed mood. New blood refers to new staff coming into the company. For example, we can inject new blood into a company. That is, bring in new people with fresh ideas. To see the writing on the wall suggests future doom or misfortune. You can refer to the study notes for a complete explanation of these idioms. So, with so much new blood coming into the company, A lot of sales staff feel that the writing's on the wall. This means that with so many new people coming into the company, a lot of staff are worried about their jobs. Now, let's go back to the dialogue. Remember, Cindy is asking about how staff changes are affecting morale. What does Nick say?
Well, everyone's job is on the line here. The most important thing is that we are fully committed to getting sales back on track.
Nick doesn't really answer Cindy's question, does he? This is a great example of tactfully or skillfully avoiding an answer by making a general statement. Nick says everyone's job is on the line. This means everyone's job is in danger. Max, their boss, then jumps into the discussion. Remember? I think that raises a different issue. We can address staff changes and morale in another meeting. Time's running short. Let's stay focused. Max is giving us examples of two useful skills here. The first is how to deal with an irrelevant question. The second is managing the time. Let's take them one by one. First, dealing with an irrelevant question. I think that raises a different issue, is another way to avoid answering a question. It's particularly suitable for irrelevant questions when your goal is to keep the discussion on track. That is, to keep the conversation focused. Listen to some other ways to deal with an irrelevant question.
I'm afraid I don't see the connection.
To be honest, I think that brings up another point, and I'd rather not cover that for now.
I'm afraid that's outside the scope of my discussion.
If the point is relevant, but you simply can't or don't wish to answer, you might also consider saying something like,
I'm afraid I'm not in the position to comment on that.
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Can I get back to you on that?
if the question is something you think you already covered earlier, you can then say,
I think I answered that earlier.
Well, as I said,
Well, as I mentioned earlier,
I think I addressed that point earlier on, but I'd be happy to discuss this with you after the meeting.
but what do you do if the question is relevant, but you want to answer it later? Listen to what Brian says later on in the dialogue when Nick asks him about the marketing situation in the UK.
Brian, would you like to comment on that?
You could also say,
I'll be happy to answer that later when we talk about product awareness.
can we come back to that issue in a bit when we go through the targets for 2007?
let's put off that topic for now. I'd like to deal with that in more detail during the sales meeting tomorrow when the whole team is present.
so, we've covered how to avoid answering unwanted questions. Now, let's review how Max controls the timing. He says, time's running short. Let's stay focused. When time is running short, that means time is running out. Just like when your car is running out of fuel. The fuel in the tank gets lower and lower. There are several more great examples of controlling the timing in today's listening. Nick says,
Okay. Well, I think we only have a few minutes left. Is there one last question?
and near the end of the session, Nick and Max both use useful expressions for controlling the timing. Nick says, I'm afraid that's just about all we have time for. Is there one last question? Max says, we really are running on a tight schedule today, as I think everyone can appreciate. These are both great expressions. There are also other phrases you can use to control the timing.
Let's try to keep the discussion on track. Can we get back to the main point?
As we're short of time, I'll have to come to that later, perhaps during the break.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, now we have just one more skill to cover today, redirecting a question. This means giving a question to someone else to answer. Nick does this with John's question about whether HarperToland's promotional materials are getting through to the key customers in their UK market. He says,
That's a very interesting issue, but I'm not fully up to speed on the marketing situation in the UK. Brian, would you like to comment on that?
to be not fully up to speed on something means not to be fully informed about it. Marketing is Brian's area of expertise, and because Nick is not fully informed about it, or perhaps wants to put some pressure on Brian, he redirects the question to Brian by saying, "Brian, would you like to comment on that?" This is redirecting the question to another person. Let's listen to some more examples.
That's a good question, but I'm afraid it's not really my field. Ms. Smith, can you help to answer that?
George, I think you know more about this. What do you think?
Great question. It's a little outside of my job scope, though. Maybe Simon. Do you want to answer that?
In addition to redirecting to another person, there are also other ways to redirect a question. You can redirect to the whole group. This is a great way to encourage discussion. Here are some examples.
Would anyone like to comment on that?
Has anyone else had a similar problem?
Great question. What do others think?
That's a good question. Let's go around the table and get some other views on this.
Finally, there's one last way to redirect a question. You can turn back the question to the questioner and let him answer it. This is called redirecting to the questioner. It's particularly useful when it's obvious that someone doesn't really want to ask a question, but rather wants to express an opinion. To redirect to the questioner, you can say,
I think that's a very interesting question. I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say on that issue.
You must have thought quite a lot about this. What do you think?
That's a very interesting question. Could I ask you what your own view is?
You might try that one next time in a job interview when someone asks you a tough question. Just kidding. Actually, that would probably not be a good idea. Let's look at a situation where redirecting to the questioner is useful.
I've been thinking a lot about this market survey. Don't you think we have a great chance to boost our sales in Vietnam?
That's an interesting question. You must have thought quite a lot about this. What's your view?
Well, there is a quickly growing middle class segment with elderly parents that have strong purchasing power. That means
Now let's